We need to remember that language does have power,
Mhm.
and language is often determined by those with power. So when marginalized and minoritized people, when queer people, when people of color, when indigenous folks, etc., say or claim language or say, hey, that language is harmful and we shouldn't be using it, we need to listen.
Yes.
Welcome to the Affirming Practice podcast. My name is Casey and Brimmer. I use they, them pronouns. And I am a doctor in social, political, ethical, and cultural thought. I've been teaching gender, sexuality, disability studies, and in an intersectional way for more than 20 years. And today we're talking about language. Introduce yourself, my friend.
Sure. My name is Bob Irian. I am a pastor in central Pennsylvania, and I'm pleased to be one of the co-hosts of this podcast. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm interested in how we build communities that are good and nurturing spaces for all people. Safety is the minimum, and I want us to be able to move beyond safety to actively encouraging people to thrive and flourish. So that's part of why I'm jazzed about this project.
I love that. Thrive and flourish. We're doing more than survive here, folks. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in one of our next episodes. So today we're talking about language and the words we keep and the words we let go, freedom of speech and the words we choose as allies. What do we do with language that is not ours to use? Who gets to use certain language and who gets to decide what language gets used when?
Mhm.
Um, and we're actually re-recording this episode because technology is what technology is. And since then, I have learned a very interesting thing about language. So, going from our intersectional perspective, who gets to even assign a name? Who gets to do
Mm.
naming? And I think naming is a part of this language, the choices we use around language. Like, do you use a person's dead name?
Right.
And what is a dead name? So, we'll get to an episode on naming at some point, I think, because it's an important concept. But in terms of language we use and language we let go, if someone is going by a new name and they choose to not go by an old name, a birth name, for example, that name is often considered a dead name. It is no longer to be used. It is no longer to be spoken. It no longer applies. So if you know someone who is going by a new name, you use that new name.
Mhm.
That's the very basic part here.
Yes. And I think it's also worth noting that this isn't about affirming any kind of ideology. This isn't about, you know, oh, just trans people demanding this or that or whatever. I mean, there's people change their names for all kinds of reasons. And I was reminded of this at the end of last week because I was listening to an audiobook and they were interviewing a gentleman whose sister had been killed, and he was talking about like the family history and the family relationship, and that his sister had changed her name from the name that she was given at birth to a different name of her own choosing. And that had nothing to do with her gender identity or her sexuality or anything. Like her gender identity and sexuality weren't even part of the equation or part of the discussion. It was just she wanted to change her name to something else, and I was struck by listening to her brother talk about his refusal to call her by her chosen name, even though his parents, who had given her her original name, had no problem making the switch. They were fine with it that, hey, if she wants to be called this other thing, fine. And I was just struck by the fact that his refusal to do so just expressed his lack of respect for her personhood in a very crystallized way that was coming out in a lot of his other comments, but that refusal made it so obvious.
Yeah. So two things come to mind when you say that. And the first is that names are a gift we can give back.
Ooh, I like that.
Names
Yeah.
are nicknames and names in general are a gift we do not ever have to receive.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when you started calling me Diz on TikTok, I could have been like, hard pass, no way.
Right. And if you
Right?
had, we would have found a different nickname.
Because 7 syllables is too much. It really is
It
for
kind of is.
TikTok.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that comes to mind is if we go back in our podcast, we've talked about the social construction of identity. Well, another social construct is language.
Mm-hmm.
And name is a good example of that. So I call you Bob, but that's not your name. And someone else calls you Bob, and someone else calls you Bob. And societally, we agree that you are Bob.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that that's the version of your name that you use.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
Uh, so to like societally, we had to agree to call you Bob.
Mm-hmm.
You and the name Bob are associated together. Only because societally we agreed that we would do the thing.
Right.
For naming, we shouldn't have to rely on society. We should just be able to say, hey, I'm this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think society and social constructs of language is an important aspect of what we're talking about here because language meaning changes over time. And that's one of the things that we're discussing this episode is because language changes over time, different words have different meanings now than they used to have.
Right.
So the word gay used to mean happy,
Mm-hmm.
and technically it still does in some contexts, but it doesn't necessarily in the context that we are in this moment.
Right.
Some language was originally used as a slur, like the word queer,
Mm-hmm.
but some folks have taken that back contextually. Like I use the word queer to describe myself, not as a slur, but because that is just a really good explanation of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and society now sees queer as something different than the slur that it was originally intended as, but also different than the original language of queer just meaning different.
Right.
Am I making sense or am I just rambling?
No, you're making very good sense. And the example that I often give people, because in my line of work, people will often ask me about biblical translations. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and what I tell people is, the King James Version was the state-of-the-art translation in 1611. In 1611, it was without doubt the best translation available in English. And the people who translated it were incredibly smart, knowledgeable people who, within the limits of and the constraints of their era, um, actually used some very ethical processes for their translation and their translation philosophy and all of that. And they established some of the standards that translators still use today. The problem is the English language has changed in the last 415 years. And, for example, there's a passage that's fairly famous where Jesus is preaching and teaching, and people are bringing their kids and they want Jesus to bless their kids. And the disciples are trying to shoo them away because they don't want Jesus to be bothered. And Jesus says, suffer the little children to come unto me and do not hinder them. Right. The King James Version says, suffer the little children. Well, we don't use suffer these days to mean allow them or let them. So modern translations will render that as let the little children come to me.
Yeah.
Right. that's just another example of how language has changed. And language has changed in a lot of ways. And, you know, the insistence that language should be static, language shouldn't change, well, that's simply not realistic. Every language changes continually, unless it's a dead language like Latin.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
other thing that I was just thought of today as we've been having this discussion, I'd never thought of it before. You mentioned, you know, my name being Bob. And I realized that yes, my name is Bob for everyone except my family of origin.
Okay.
And in my family of origin, I am not Bob, in part, in large part, because in my family of origin, Bob is my dad.
Mm-hmm.
They have other nicknames for me. Nobody, the only people who call me Robert are like telemarketers calling me. So I always know if somebody asks for Robert, I know it's a telemarketer. Um, but that sort of agreement that, Bob and my person are associated, even that has its limits.
Yeah.
And I get to choose whether or not to give people a pass on that. So, like, you may have noticed I mentioned that my family has other nicknames for me, and I didn't mention what those were because my family are the only people who get a pass on using those.
Yeah.
Um, I will not answer to them from anyone else. And uh, the other thing that is interesting to me is when I introduce myself as Bob, nobody questions it. Like people just automatically say, oh, yeah, his name is Bob. That's what we're going to call him. And it's kind of ridiculous that other people have to justify their choice of name, what they choose to go by.
Yeah. I think families are like micro societies.
Mm-hmm.
They're a societal group. And so we all have different connections with how our family uses language, including naming. And like I said, names are a gift you can give back. In my case, I go by Casey Ann probably 99% of the time. I can think of maybe six people who are allowed to just call me Casey, and only like two that are allowed to call me Case. And that's because in my family, when they pulled out your middle name, you were in trouble.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I like my middle name, so I don't want it to be that. So I just
Mm-hmm.
started going by Casey Ann in like third grade, to the point that in college, like undergrad, and then even the day I got married, people didn't know my last name. Like the pastor who I had been going to church with for like 4 years at that point said the last name on the day I got married. And I'm like, well, that's good because that's the last time I'm using that last name. um, but like what we agree words mean is the point here. And I think using names as a way to articulate that helps. So, this episode, we're talking about what to do with language that is not ours to use, who gets to use certain language, who gets to decide what language gets used. There are several reasons why language matters. So, it sets expectations for engagement, as particularly things like labels. So, if I say I'm autistic, it gives you a reference point for understanding me to some degree. Now, that depends on how you understand autism, but it might help you understand if I miss that social cue, right? If I say I'm a lesbian, particularly in the dating scene, that typically tells men not to waste their time. It sets expectations for engagement because we have certain ways we understand that language, and how when we understand a language in the same way, it's like, okay, I know that person's not interested in men. I know that person might miss social cues. So it sets those expectations. It can affirm or invalidate identities, causing healing or harm. This is an example of naming again. If we choose to use people's chosen names, which we should, then we can help even like at least reduce active harm, but also heal harm. Because when I get called my chosen name, it heals my heart.
Mhm.
It just does. Same thing with pronouns. When people use the right pronouns for me, for a lot of people, I'm just like, this is important to me, please do it. And they do. And then there are the people, I'll use the example of my brother, who struggles to get my pronouns right, but he actively corrects himself. And like recently, he sent a text to one of his buddies showing them a sticker I had designed on Ben's behalf. And he used my pronouns correctly in the text message. Like, Casey Ann designed this. They said they can order as many as we need, whatever. And he sent me a screenshot of his friend's response, so I got to see him use the pronouns. And I had the little, like a happy little meltdown. Because someone I care about took the time to care about me and to use my pronouns in the right way. And there are also people in my life who don't get to be in my life because they refuse to try to use my pronouns actively and to correct themselves when they make mistakes or accept correction when they make mistakes. So, language can be used to affirm or invalidate others.
The whole thing about affirming or invalidating is ultimately this is about respecting somebody as a human being.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the most fruitful ways I have found to illustrate this for folks who, claim that it's, you know, some woke agenda or whatever is I start calling them by pronouns other than their chosen pronouns. Um, I was in a conversation with a friend and an acquaintance, and the acquaintance was, you know, very adamant that, pronouns are bullshit and blah, blah, blah. And I was just simply saying, everybody has pronouns. We all use pronouns. And he was being belligerent and obnoxious about it. So I just started calling him she when, quite obviously his preferred pronouns were he, him. And I started calling him she. And within about 2 minutes, he was getting quite upset. And I said, thank you for illustrating my point.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a method that lots of folks choose. And we need to remember that language does have power.
Mhm.
And language is often determined by those with power. So when marginalized and minoritized people, when queer people, when people of color, when indigenous folks, etc., say or claim language or say, hey, that language is harmful and we shouldn't be using it, we need to listen.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
and that's a great example of how you can make that point. I think you can also do it with honorifics.
Hmm.
Um, I keep thinking of all the people who still call me Miss when they know I have a PhD. And one of my favorite perks of my PhD is doctor is gender neutral. Thank you. Actually, doctor isn't gender neutral. Doctor is gender inclusive.
Yes.
Like anyone can be this thing and it affirms who you are in that moment. Um, Being neutral to me is like precision of language, I think is something we talked about when we first recorded this episode that we are now re-recording, is it can be very important to folks to have precise language. And so for me, being neutral is not an option.
Hmm.
Inclusivity, affirmation, those things are options. It's like the difference between survive and, as you said at the start of the episode, flourish and thrive,
Hmm.
right? We know what we're looking for. And we did the episode on like welcoming people contingently as guests versus welcoming them as integral to the community. That's how we're looking at what it means to welcome is precision of language.
Right.
So the next point that we have is that some words are culturally closed, meaning that people of a specific culture can use that language, but people outside of that culture should not be using that language. And there's a couple of different ways that this happens. So the first, if we're looking at like LGBT identities or queer identities, and someone identifies as two-spirit, but they're white, that's a culturally closed identity. If you are not indigenous, you are not two-spirit. That is a culturally closed thing, meaning only people of that culture can identify with that. Now, that's not to say we can't say the word. If someone says, "Hey, I'm two-spirit, please refer to me as such," then we need to refer to them in the way that they're asking us to.
Right.
And that gets a little bit different with like words that might be seen as slurs coming from outside of the community. We have to determine how we want to handle that and talk with the person about how we're going to approach that. But that brings the next example of if you're not black, you can't say the N word. And we all know what we mean by that word.
Hmm.
If you don't know what I mean by that word, you can use Google and get that information. But as a white person, I'm never going to say that word.
Right.
I don't care if 100 people, black people give me permission to. That word is not coming out of my mouth.
Hmm.
Um, the other word example that we have is if you're not queer, you need to be careful about how you use the word queer. If you're throwing queer around as an insult, oh, that queer, or you effing queer, whatever. If you're throwing it around as an insult, especially if you're not LGBT, then that's not your word to use like that. Um, if you are using it because you're saying, oh, the queer community, okay, that's reasonable. Um, if you are using it because I say something very specific, like I say, I'm queer, I want to be referred to as queer, that's very important to me, that then that's what you use to describe me. I think at one point you had asked, can I use that word?
And I was asking about using it in a very specific context and for a very specific reason. And the reason that I'm hesitant about it, and I still am careful about my use of it, is because it has been used as a slur. And I I think about words that have been used as slurs the same way I think about guns and knives. Use them very, very carefully and exercise caution. And so, for a word that has been marginalized, or excuse me, has been weaponized against a marginalized community, that I am, as much as I try to be an ally of, I am not a member of. I'm going to tread very, very carefully around that word because it's not mine to just say, oh, I can use that word because I'm one of the good guys. No, it's never been weaponized against me in the way that it has been weaponized against members of the LGBTQ community. And so therefore, you know, I don't get to make that decision
Yeah,
for myself. At least that's how I view it.
yeah, that makes sense. And asking people in the community, asking the people who are asking you to use the language, because you asked me the question, can I use this language? When should I?
Mhm.
Um, I think that's the best way to go if you're referring to someone specifically. And that goes back to pronouns too. Something I ask my students in my classes is, what pronouns do you want me to use in class? Are these the pronouns you want me to use in all circumstances, or are there circumstances where you're like, please don't?
Mhm. And there are, I have friends who are part of the LGBTQ community who that is their preferred form of identification. They would prefer that if I am introducing them as a member of the community, that I introduce them as queer, or that I describe them as gender queer. That's their
Yeah,
preferred identity. And there are other people who are friends of mine who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community who do not want me to use that word. And the reason that I know that about those various people is because I've asked the question.
yeah,
Um, and it's, for me, it's, again, it comes back to basic respect. do I care enough about this person and do I respect this person enough to ask them, how would you like me to introduce you, describe you, talk about you? And how would you like me to not do so?
Yeah.
And then to actually take that on board and do that.
Yeah. Um, I think that take that on board and do that. The follow through is what matters here, right?
Mhm.
Listening to people and referring to them in their chosen way. Which brings me kind of to our next point, which there's a connection here. And part of the language that we're discussing and how it changes over time includes disabled folks and disabled language around disability. So the following is an excerpt from Dr. Ashley Shu's Against Techno-Labalism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement. And it's about the excerpt is about the difference and how we shifted from using the phrase handicapped to using the word disabled and
Mhm.
other language around disability and whether or not we do or don't use it. So Shu writes, historically, disabled people have been described using terms like unfit, invalid, crippled, and handicapped. These all denote slightly different things. Unfit is more likely to contain congenital, developmental, and genetic related disabilities. Invalid is more likely to refer to chronically or physically disabled people and war wounded. Crippled refers most often to disabilities that affect mobility. And handicapped is a catch all for those disadvantaged by disability, in some cases, including both mental and physical disability. Originally, many laws referring to disabled people used the word handicapped. Now, many have simply been updated with new terms, essentially using find and replace to swap handicap with disability. This includes laws still in effect today, like the Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDEA, which was known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act from 1975 to 1990. The word handicap still circulates, mostly among older people who grew up with this being the preferred term, but it went out of fashion for at least two reasons. One thing that sank the term handicap was the offensive etymology often given for the term. One I sometimes still hear people repeat as true, and she goes on to articulate where the word handicap came from, being about like hand and cap and putting your cap out and asking for money, um, where actually it came from sports. Um, I
Like a
love
golf
this.
handicapped or somebody handicapping horses.
Yeah. I love Ashley's articulation around language. And something that she goes on to talk about is, for example, and I do this, I refer to myself as cripple sometimes. And I refer to using crip theory and things like crip time in my dissertation and being something that I study.
Mhm.
And someone who is not disabled can still refer to crip theory as crip theory, or they can refer to it as disability theory. Um, but someone not disabled, especially not physically disabled, calling me a cripple is going to make me put my hobble sticks to their other use. And I say that as a joke, but cripple is one of those words that you can use as a slur or use as like use within a community as affirmation.
Right.
And if it's not your language, don't use it.
Right.
Um, Do you have any thoughts on that excerpt from Shu, or do you want to move on to the person first language stuff?
I think something that goes with a lot of what we've talked about so far, um, and you mentioned it in the intro, and if you were planning to get to this in a minute, I can hold my comment till then. But the idea of freedom of speech is one that is interesting because I will often hear it come up in terms of people saying, well, I have freedom of speech, so I can use the N word, or I have freedom of speech, so I can, call this person handicapped or whatever word they want to use. And that's true. Okay. The First Amendment, I actually pull it up occasionally and read it for people. The actual text of the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I always like to point out for folks, Congress shall make no law, right? So yes, you have the freedom. Congress cannot outlaw you using that word, right? That doesn't mean you get to use it without consequences, right? It's like I can say to my boss, you're an asshole. Congress cannot prevent me from using that word to describe my boss. That doesn't mean my boss can't fire me for using it.
Yeah.
You know, and yes, you may have freedom of speech for a to use a particular word or description or whatever, but you need to be prepared for consequences when you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for people who complain when they are confronted with the consequences of their own choices to disrespect another human being with their language.
Yeah.
Um, you've kind of earned those consequences. Please enjoy them.
Yeah. I I would agree with that. The freedom from consequences is something that people associate with freedom of speech, but that's just not how it works. And
Mhm.
it goes with what you choose to say and what you choose not to say. So there are also consequences for what you choose not to say. So, for example, if you refuse to use someone's chosen pronouns and that person says, "Hey, I can't have you in my life if you're not willing to try," that's a consequence of you exercising your freedom of speech in a way that causes harm.
Mhm.
Um, okay. So our next point here is person first or identity first language. And there's a couple of perspectives here. So for person first puts person at the start of the language. So person with a disability, person on the autism spectrum. Identity first language puts disability at the start. Disabled person, autistic person. Many disabled and autistic folks prefer disabled person, autistic person, rather than person with autism or person with a disability. And this is because, in part, from my understanding and from how I use it, is I can't take away my disability from who I am. We looked at intersectionality. I am always autistic. I am always disabled in one capacity or another. And that's become part of my identity. Not my diagnosis necessarily, though, yeah, autism, yes, but my experiences with the world are part of my identity, and I don't want people to take them away. I prefer disabled person or KCN is disabled. KCN is autistic rather than KCN is a person with autism. One, cut out a bunch of words. Two, like this is it's the person who it's being applied to gets to make the decision on the language. And related to that, I think about at some point recently we were on a live and heard the word wheelchair bound, as though
Mhm.
being in a wheelchair was a binding instead of something that gives a person freedom.
Mm. Mhm.
So things like wheelchair user
Mhm.
is more appropriate language in today's cultural point, in today's time frame. Do you have any thoughts on person first or identity first language or questions that you want to share?
Two thoughts. One is, again, it comes back to respect. Ask the person, you know, that, as you said, the person that the language is being applied to gets to choose which language should be applied. And the other that occurs to me is that so many of the uh, terms that we avoid using these days were developed and applied to different communities by people outside those communities, largely because people in those communities were viewed as less than. You know, people with disability were never consulted about whether they wanted to be described as handicapped or people with disabilities or disabled people. Like nobody ever asked them because they were just assumed to be, well, why would we ask them? Right.
Yeah.
Um, Same thing with cis heterosexism and the ways in which the LGBTQIA plus community was described. Same thing with a lot of identities. And it's like a lot of the racial slurs, people within racially marginalized communities are not the people who invented racial slurs for themselves.
Yeah.
Um, those slurs were applied to them by others who never bothered to ask because why would we care what they think?
Yeah.
And that right there is the fundamental problem.
Yeah. So what you just said makes me think of something that I think is a really important way to think about this, to think about language, to think about who's in the room, who's making the decisions, and not just about language, about a lot of things. And it comes from disability rights activists. Anything about us without us is not for us.
Mhm.
So I'm going to say that again. Anything about us without us is not for us. Meaning, when the decisions are being made about marginalized and minoritized people's lives, about disabled people, about queer people, we need to be in the room with a voice that's being heard and documented and actually considered that the decisions are being made in. Um, it's a really important thing. And it goes back to we get to determine the language used to describe us, but it also goes back to the laws that are being formed around and about us. Um, okay, so we talked about at the start about how language determines, like, it sets expectations for interaction. And part of my notes says how to recognize the whole person without tokenizing them. So, how does saying I'm disabled impact others' interactions with me? Others are going to say, oh, that person's disabled, and they've got all these understandings of what disability means, but do they know what it means to me? So to tokenize someone is to take one experience or a generalized stereotypical experience and apply it to absolutely everyone of that identity,
Mhm.
right? So if I say I'm disabled, and you don't have more details than that, but you're like, okay, well, they're disabled. They can't walk. They can't do anything for themselves, whatever. They're applying these stereotypes to me that and stigmas to me and who I am. That's tokenizing. But when I say I'm disabled and I need a cane to walk, how you respond to that makes a difference. In the same way with like language, like I'm queer. How you respond to that. Are you responding with kind curiosity, going back to episode one? Or are you responding with prejudice, bias, and stereotypes? And that's something to consider with how you interact with the world. If you know you don't know a lot about an identity, listen to the people of that identity. And this episode, I think, all comes back to listen to the people. Anything about us without us is not for us. So listening to us about our own experiences and don't generalize based off of one person's experience that you've heard.
And I would just emphasize that even stereotypes that are well intentioned or are stereotypes that are intended or that lead us in a direction of compassion, it's still a stereotype, right?
And
So
it can cause
if,
harm.
right. And, you know, it can lead me to, for instance, to use disability uh, as a example. So, um, to use disability as an example, if I make assumptions, oh, we have a guest speaker coming and I know that they are disabled. And so therefore, I need to do XYZ to prepare for them. Instead of asking the question, if I just operate on certain stereotypes, I may wind up putting in place a whole bunch of accommodations that they don't actually need and not putting in place the ones that would actually be helpful. So it's important to remember that, you know, all of us carry certain baggage around in our heads and certain preconceived notions and assumptions. And we all need to be aware of that, that just because I want to be affirming and thoughtful and caring to my neighbor doesn't mean that I am immune to the possibility of prejudice and
Hmm.
stereotypes.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I'm going to move us into our put it into practice.
Mm-hmm.
And today's put it into practice, we ask you to share your thoughts and experiences with language that belongs to you and that which doesn't. What language do you have questions around? What language do you want to know how to use in the proper context, or when it's okay to use it, when isn't it? Language that you are unsure of, or how to use certain pronouns if you're not sure. Please feel free to ask those questions. As always, you can leave comments, respond in a video, and tag us, or use the Google form linked in our bio or in the description, depending on what platform you're listening on. And we look forward to hearing from you. We hope you will interact. We hope you will follow us on whatever platform you're listening to now. And we hope that you will follow us on the other platforms that we are on: TikTok, Spotify, iHeartRadio, any of it. Your support helps us keep going.
Yes. And by all means, please ask questions. If you want to ask a question anonymously, we have a form for that, because we really want to tailor this podcast to helping people navigate the things that they're not sure about navigating and answering the questions that are most relevant and pressing for people. Because, and we've said it several times, when we know better, we do better.
Definitely. All right. So, the big takeaway from today is anything about us without us is not for us. And if the language is not yours, step away from it. You don't have to use language just because it's the only language you've ever known. You get to choose what language you use, and you get to practice using appropriate language. So we hope that you will also share your experiences with that in the comments. Do you have anything before we wrap up?
Just one last takeaway, which is it's never a bad thing to ask the question about the language that you are using. It's never a bad thing to ask, is this appropriate language? I have never asked somebody, can I use this language, or which language should I use, and received a negative response from that. Most people are just grateful that I'm trying and are
Yeah.
willing to help me learn what I don't know. So it's never a bad thing to ask.
And if you are unsure about asking any questions, check out episode 1 on context, common sense, and kind curiosity, because those are good set of guidelines for whether or not to ask, as is, would you ask your granny that question?
Mhm.
Um, but we are a safe place to ask those questions. So please feel free to ask us. And if we don't know the answers, we'll look them up. We'll get in touch with people who do. So that is what I have for you today. Remember that you are important, you matter, you are brave for taking the time and having the courage to learn about this stuff. And I hope you take care of yourselves because you are too important not to. Anything for you?
And I hope that you will remember that you do matter, you are valid, you are precious, and you are, as always, deeply and profoundly loved.
Bye, y'all.
Take care.